I'm really interested in your process with Don Caballero, and I'm also interested in, do you have any advice for a musician who wants to just give back to the community and doesn't care about profit, but also just wants to help people make art rather than necessarily be the maker? Like, how would a person go about, like, following that service?
Well, part one, Don Caballero they sort of existed in several iterations. The first iteration is the one that I worked with, first or maybe 1.1 was the one that I worked with at first, and they recorded in the basement of my house when I still had a home studio, and you know, they were phenomenal musicians, and they thought about music in an abstract way, and I was really engaged by them and the way that they did things, and I was impressed by their skill and all that sort of stuff. Then they went through some changes, and then I worked with them again later toward late stage, when there were much more tensions and alcoholism in the band. And that manifested itself in the band members sort of working on different songs in a kind of a begrudging manner, like okay, I will allow us to pursue this song if I'm allowed to pursue this other aspect of this other thing. And so there was a very, very strict tension in the band during that later era, which eventually caused the dissolution of the band, I think. Different experiences when they were very young versus when they were an established band who'd been touring for a long time and had developed, you know, years of grievance. As far as making yourself useful as a facilitator, my advice is always to find people that think like you, make it clear that you want to help, and stick with those people. Like, it might not be now that somebody comes to you for help. It might be 4 years from now that they remember that you have this resource or that you have this that you've offered to help, and in 4 years you might get a phone call, and that phone call would be the fruit of having spent the previous 4 years making yourself available again and again and again. And it's just, again, you do it because you feel like that's what you should be doing, and not because you expect an immediate result. And it can be a very long time. Like, there are people that I've worked with in the studio after having known them for 20 odd years. I just did a session a few weeks ago with John Langford from the Mekons, a band that I had admired at a distance, and a guy who had lived in my neighborhood for the better part of 25 years, but we just never found an excuse to do anything together. And then we finally did, and we got along famously, and it was fantastic, you know. So I say things like, find people that think like you, make yourself available to them, do what you can to participate in the scene and in the community of musicians with an open-minded basis, without expecting remuneration, without expecting anything to develop out of it, and then eventually something may happen, you know. No promises. But.
Hey, my name's Brian.
Hey, Brian.
I have like a question to ask you regarding labels, and you spent a lot of time regarding labels. I talked about labels. Whenever I hear the word label, I think of loan, mostly because I'm a millennial with about $55,000 worth of debt. I'm not here to like bitch or complain, but you know, when it comes to a ledger and a balance statement, I think I got $55,000 here, I got $20,000 on a car, credit, blah, 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 blah. And I love how you broke down, like, fuck money, think about community. But, you know, as someone who delves myself in many genres, I hear the argument back and forth, like the argument between the both of you. And no offense, I don't understand why labels still exist when a lot of times labels treat artists as profit centers, much like how colleges treat students as profit centers.
I agree with you 100% on both counts. Oh. Like, I think that the notion that other people should be, like, externalities should be profiting from education, I find that a shocking debasement of the notion of education. And I agree with you that record labels extracting money from the scene rather than participating in it on a sort of an egalitarian or equitable basis, I also find that reprehensible.
The question that I wanted to ask, because like, I mean, I'm sitting here at Drexel. I got into Drexel like a million years ago, and it was $35,000. It's probably like, what, 70 now? My question that I want to ask you is, in the era of internet, in the era where content gets manipulated by stakeholders like Spotify, you could buy into Spotify now if you own a label. My question to you is, I'm not asking to tell the future, but how do you see the present and the future changing for music in terms of content creation and community? Because when I hear music industry, I laugh. 'Cause
Right.
I've been in the finance industry, I've been in the tech industry, I've been in nonprofits. My background's IO psychology. I think we should really be more community driven.
Sure.
Like, Chicago, like I was just there 3 weeks ago on tour. They still do that shit.
Yeah.
You're right.
Well, I know you said you didn't want me to tell the future. I'm going to tell the future. I think that these streaming services, these like subscription models, the streaming services, the satellite radio networks that you have to be a member of, like all of these things, are clearly a stopgap measure on the way toward a more open, genuinely free approach to content on the internet. And the reason that I know that is that at every stage of technology, there has been a paradigm shift that has made music more and more and more accessible to more and more and more people. And the dominant format has been the one that is most convenient. So, for example, live music was supplanted by radio because radio was more convenient, right? Radio was supplanted by record collections because record collections were more convenient. Record collections were supplanted by cassettes, where you could make samplings of your record collection to play precisely the songs you wanted in the order you wanted. Cassettes were supplanted by CDs, where you could have an enormous quantity of music available in a physically very small place. CDs were supplanted by streaming and downloading and things like that, because you could then have an even larger quantity of music available even more easily with no physical artifact whatsoever. Those purchasing and owning libraries systems were supplanted by streaming networks, because then you had essentially infinite content that you could access at any time, or that would play itself to amuse you as a kind of a personalized radio station, right? I can imagine something more convenient than that. Something that is an autonomous app, say. I'm using the term app because I can't think of anything else to call it. An autonomous solution, I like that word, I'm going to use it. An autonomous solution that, when triggered, would scour the internet for whatever is of interest to you, find it, and play it for you, without having to be a member of anything, without having to pay anyone anything, without having to buy license to anything. If it exists out there, this autonomous thing will go find it and bring it to you. That seems more convenient to me than having to be a member of a streaming service and having to pay for something like that. And I think it is the natural next step, and I can imagine that happening fairly soon. From a technological standpoint, it seems like it should be possible now. There's a parallel that I want to bring up. Does anybody know what a Thor stream is for television? Anybody in this room know what a Thor stream is? Thor stream is a set-top box that you can buy, and when you buy the box, you are a member of this network, and the Thor stream finds content all over the world and funnels it to your television. So if there is a television program that you wanted to watch that transpired many years ago or in another country, or if there's a sporting event that you wanted to see that may have happened a long time ago or in another country, you can fight your way through a rather crude menu on the ThorStream interface, and it will find it for you, and it will play it for you. Now, there's a lot of things that are kind of crappy, like a handheld camera in a movie theater version of a movie, but you can see the movie, right? Some of them are full HD, hi-fi sound, some are broadcast quality, whatever. That is the sort of thing that I'm imagining, but for music, where you can express your desires to this thing, and the thing will go find it and bring it to you and play it for you. That seems way easier to me than having to be a member or pay an authorization fee or, give up any personal data, right? And I don't see why something like that won't happen. And so I think that's probably the next thing. And I think in the same way that CDs were a stopgap between the physical media era and the ephemeral digital media era, and CDs had a very limited lifespan. I think that streaming services and downloadable libraries, for example, have a limited lifespan. And there are a couple of things that indicate that that's going to be a necessary development. There was just recently an ebook company that had gone out of business, and all of the libraries that people had downloaded under their readers of ebooks that they had bought from this company went offline and disappeared. And that doesn't happen if you buy a physical book and put it on your shelf. That book is never going to disappear. And then not long ago, MySpace had a technical failure where all of their archived music and images for a certain population, for a certain period, disappeared. And I personally know of people whose entire creative output was stored on their MySpace page, which was at this point a vestigial legacy. But in some of these cases, that's the entire creative output of somebody, and that somebody died, and now their entire life's work is erased from the planet, right? And that is what happens when there is a proprietary control over information. And I think the progression that we're seeing is that mechanisms are being instituted or invented to defeat proprietary control over information and over artistic content. Did that answer your question? Okay, good.
Hi.
Hi.
I just had a quick question. So I think that in this conversation about the internet as a potential tool for positive development with music, I have a record label that I've done out of my basement. Next year will be 20 years, and so it had seen before the internet and after. And I think I would take a little bit of issue, and I would just be curious your feedback with this idea of the internet as an inherently democratizing force. I think for someone who comes to the experience of discovering music from an empowered position of, I'm going to listen to what I hear from my friends who I respect, it could be one kind of experience, but a friend of mine who's a music writer at the Post, recently did an experiment where he went to high schools and asked young people, how do you hear about music? And for so many, it was places like YouTube and Spotify. And I guess, to me, I think that there are lots of things that people who have the values, someone like you has about community and finding exciting artists, might take issue with a company. Like, for example, I have a deep, deep hatred for Spotify, partially because I think it breeds like a dependence from artists. So I long made the case to the artists on my label that there were damaging aspects of Spotify. It pays independents out at a lower rate than it pays major labels. There's a real gatekeeper culture around the playlists that are, making people money and paying at a lower rate. But at the same time, the local coffee shop and your hairdresser and all these places that play music that people hear are playing Spotify channels all day. So you could have the analysis that I do of like, I fucking hate you, I can't quit you. And even every band I've ever been in has their music on Spotify. I think Spotify is a disgusting company that sucks creativity out. So do you think that there are things that artists and musicians can do when they find a company so reprehensible, but they're also wanting to exist in the world and be heard, of how to balance that?
You are placing the emphasis on the company Spotify as a top-down expression of a culture. Like the Spotify is presenting a certain set of playlists, a certain set of choices, right? In your situation, my complaint would be with an audience that is not interested in an adventurous experience. That's all the same people, the coffee house, the hairdresser, the library. They would previously have just be playing the radio, which is a much more limited palette of music than Spotify, because there are a limited number of radio stations. And it would also be ingrained into the commercialization of radio, where you would also be forced to listen to advertisements, even potentially for your competitors in your own coffee shop. So there are always going to be tiers of appreciation for music. There are going to be people like you and me, for whom music means the world, and we are going to burrow into it and find all of the things that are most valuable to us, and we're going to cling to them, and those things are going to become part of our personality. And one of them will be the Ramones and will make me see the world differently, right? There are also people who don't give a fuck about music, but they just want to be able to push a button and have some sound, and whatever comes out is fine with them. I like all kinds of music. Like that mentality is always going to be dominant in the culture. By that I mean there are always going to be more people for whom music is just a minor, trivial diversion than there are people for whom music is an important cultural vector and that they want to invest themselves in heavily. For the people that don't give a shit about music but just want to push a button, there will always be a solution that is the equivalent of top 40 radio. And in Spotify, I'm sure that there is a course equivalent of that. And that, I think, is not going to be defeatable by the people who are not part of it. Like, if you're not in that tier of music made for people who don't like music, you're not going to have any influence on it as an idiom. What we can do, what Joe does, what you do, what I do, is operate ethically within our peer group and on the tier of people that we know and interact with that are passionate about music, and make sure that we are square with them, and that when Spotify and all of these other things collapse of their own weight because they are not providing value for their cost, and they collapse of their own weight into these, whatever the next thing is, we are safe from that collapse because we don't depend on it. My studio has had as its principal client base underground musicians and independent musicians since it opened more than 20 years ago. In that intervening 20 years, the bottom fell out of the mainstream music business and budgets for records collapsed. Bands that were getting $250,000 to make an album, suddenly they either lost their record deal altogether or they were getting a few $1,000s as a budget to make a record album, right? My studio never depended on those big $250,000 projects. We always made our rent from the small scale, independent, localized, and like non-connected music scene, which has survived unscathed through that whole thing. Like, every live music venue that had music going on in the early 90s is still there, still has a full schedule of bands. Those bands are still playing, a lot of the same bands, also brand new ones, right? All the record stores that were open in the 90s that made money by selling records, they're all gone. All the radio stations that made money by airing commercials and broadcasting radio that was playlisted and influenced by payola and other kinds of bribery, they're all gone, right? There's been a consolidation and a shrinking of the terrestrial radio market. So the people that have operated outside of that paradigm have survived, I'm not going to say unscathed, but by maintaining our connections within our local community and with our ideological community, we've been able to survive those bellwether changes. And I think the same thing is true when it comes to the digital distribution of music and media. Like, there are going to be these collapses and failures and inequities in the mainstream distribution model that uses these playlists and other kinds of corrupt influence, the buying in that you described, the way that major labels have equity in the streaming services and independent labels don't have equity in the streaming services, blah, blah, blah. That stuff is going to collapse of its own weight because it's not providing value for its cost. Whereas on our scale, like, you do a good job for the bands that you work with, I try to do a good job for the bands that I work with. I'm going to assume that your profit sharing arrangement with your artists is an equitable one. I've just assumed that because you have an honest face. I try to maintain an equitable relationship with the people that I work with, where I don't overcharge them, where I don't expect them to pay more than they can. I don't try to hoodwink them into doing more or spending more than they need to. And that kind of thinking, that kind of ethical behavior on the scale below the maximized capitalist model, if that ethical behavior continues, then there's no reason that those underground networks can't continue, and there's no reason that things can't progress, albeit at the smaller scale, but at a survivable scale where we can keep doing it. And as I've said before, I consider the capability to keep doing it as the only measure of success for me. Did that answer your question? Okay. I'm sorry, it seems like it was a fairly unsatisfying answer. Yeah.
In fact, like, I think that people are dependent on them, and even people who fucking hate them are dependent on them. And when the Washington Post did a piece about label owners who hate Spotify, I was one of two people who spoke. Within 5 minutes, a Spotify PR person called me on cell phone. I was like, we think you have some misinformation about us. And I know they're so insidious and corrupt, and it can't be overstated. And at the same time, I can't quit them. They breed dependency, and I think, but I mean, I hear what you're saying. I guess we should just ignore the ugly elephant in the room with all.
I'm not saying to ignore it. I'm saying that your ability to influence that is extremely limited, as you are aware, and it is all ultimately driven by consumers and what they choose to participate in. And my point is that there is always going to be a larger number of people for whom music is a trivial afterthought, background sound, and those people are going to always be sort of those people are going to be driven by convenience and by, the superficial aspects of popular culture. The people like you and me and Joe who are in music as lifers, as pathetic as that is, that gives me great satisfaction knowing that I've spent my life in and around music. And those people are going to need to maintain all the networks that we've used to survive through everything up until now. I don't think there's a magic bullet that's going to make the mainstream, conventional, top-tier professional music business more ethical at any point. It exists as an exploitative game, and it always will. I choose not to participate in it. Like, I don't have to behave that way myself, and I won't. And that allows me to feel like I'm proceeding with clean hands with everybody that I deal with on my level,
So I feel like Phil Donahue, by the way. It's kind of like walking around. We have time for about maybe one or two more questions, but there is going to be a lovely reception out here with tasty treats and snacks and things, and I think you will be sticking around for it, maybe.
Yeah,
and
sure.
So, tasty treats, snacks.
Sure.
And so, we have about 10 minutes left, and then we will empty out into the lobby, and then there will be more time to ask.
And if any of you have questions for John Solomon, he'll be at the...
Including about the aptly named mentally ill. So we'll do one or two more, but this person's been waiting, and then I see a bunch of other hands. I'll try to get to everybody.
Thanks.
Yeah, when you're working with a band on a record, how do you decide how much to personally insert yourself into the process? Like, how do you decide when to sit back and just engineer or kind of lean in and give more suggestions and produce?
My default is to not form opinions about the music and to not make suggestions unless I'm asked to. My default is to assume that the band has it figured out and that they're going to make the record that suits them if I give them all of the creative decisions. And it's quite often the case that while I'm working on a record, I'm not listening to the music the way a listener would. I'm listening to the music as a series of disassociated technical problems, and I have other things on my mind, like I want to make sure the sight lines are correct, and I want to make sure that nobody's going to trip over that cable that's coming across that doorway, and there are things that I have to do to make the session go smoothly that have nothing to do with the music, and that's the majority of my energy is spent on that sort of stuff. It's extremely rare for me to hear music being recorded in the studio and for an idea to pop into my head about something that we could do to that music. That's extremely rare. And I think that's because I've trained myself not to listen to music in the same way that I would if I was engaging with it as a fan. I think that's an unhelpful mentality to be sitting there rocking out to the music and getting lost in it, and then as a result, not paying attention to the tape running out or to the meters indicating a poor recording level, or the microphone slipping out of position or whatever. Like, this is a slightly crude analogy, but I've used it before and I like it. I feel like I need to have a sort of a gynecological relationship with the music, meaning that I shouldn't be getting turned on by the vagina that I'm working on at the moment. I need to have a professional relationship with the music and not be getting distracted by whatever its natural charms are, right? That cuts both ways, and that wasn't a continuation of the metaphor. That was just... I also don't want anyone in the studio to be worried about what I think about their music. Like, I don't want anyone in the studio to be sitting there thinking, oh, we're being judged right now. Steve doesn't think we're cool enough, right? I don't want anyone to have that as a thought. I want them to be concentrated on doing their thing and feeling free to do it however they want. My job is to facilitate it and its expression and make sure that nothing goes wrong. It's not my job to try to, like, nudge it toward some ideal. I feel like that kind of thinking, as it can be done with the best intent, but I think it is sort of universally destructive. I'll give you an example. When I was just getting started as an engineer, and I was sitting in on other people's sessions a lot to try to educate myself about studio techniques and how sessions should proceed in a studio, I was invited to sit in on a session for a band who were, at the time, heroes of mine, a band called the Effigies from Chicago. They were one of the great bands of the punk era in Chicago. I admired them tremendously. I thought their music was invigorating. They had a fantastic, coherent band sound. And a big part of that sound was their guitar player was a guy named Earl Latek, who played in a super aggressive style, very riffy, very propulsive style. And he had a signature sound, which was his orange amplifier. He had a black Strat and an orange amplifier, and that was always all knobs all the way up. Like, that was just a standard thing for him, was all the knobs all the way up. So it was just this ripping, uncontrolled sound, and it was a big part of what made them such an exciting band, right? So I was sitting in on a session where they were setting up all their gear, getting started in the session. Like, Earl had his guitar set up, and he's playing a few chords, and it sounds like Earl. It sounds fantastic, right? And then I see the engineer walk into the studio and start talking to Earl, and then Earl is sort of gesturing at his amplifier, and and I couldn't, it was through the glass, so I couldn't hear what they were talking about, but I saw this little back and forth a little bit. And then I saw the engineer reach over and turn his master volume down. And then Earl played his guitar again, and it sounded a little weaker, But the engineer was sort of animated about, like, oh yeah, see how much better that sounds? See how, like, I've cleaned it up for you, and so now it sounds more precise or whatever. And at that moment, I realized that with the best intention, that engineer was making that record worse. Like, he was trying to help, genuinely trying to help, but he didn't get it. And because he didn't recognize what was important about that setup and that person and that moment, by trying to help, he weakened that record. And I was slightly crestfallen at that moment. And that image, that transaction kind of burned its way into my psyche, and it has made me very circumspect about getting involved in the process of a band getting their shit together and making their music. Like, I might form an opinion way down the road about what could have been done differently or what could have been done better, but in the moment, I'm much more likely to fuck something up than I am to improve things. So, okay.
Okay. Yeah. I hate to bring us back to the internet, but I'm going to.
Okay, so that as soon as you bring it back to the internet, that knocks one question off the list, so we get to do one more. Okay.
Okay, I'll be quick. One of the things that concerns me about the internet versus when I would have to drive 200 miles to go to a record store that wasn't a big box record store back in the 80s, and I would get an album that I knew was going to be fucking amazing, and then I got it and I didn't like it. I still listen to that album because I drove 200 miles to buy it, and I wasn't going to have a chance to do that again. It's so easy online to get caught up in an echo chamber, and it's certainly even if we were to create this app that you would like to see, it's still going to be built on our preferences.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering about your thoughts about that, how we break out of that echo chamber in that online environment when it's playing to what we like.
Yeah, in the pre-internet era, we required sort of trusted mediators. Like you'd go to the record shop, and he would say, you know, that second Talking Heads album is really good. The third one, not so much. Like that sort of thing. Or you know, like if he saw you buying a Gang of Four record, he would say, "Have you heard of Wire?" Like those sorts of things, right? So all of those moments, those little interactions, we now sort of have to rely on our peers and our friends for those, because they are going to be more informed. They're going to be like, every one of them is the kind of manic nerd in a record store, but for his own or her own personal tastes, right? The thing that's great about record stores is that people develop these sort of savant-like tendencies where they have very narrow but very deep knowledge of arcane stuff, and they can bring you around because they want you to hear the good stuff. They can bring you around to these moments that they think that you'll appreciate, and they're doing that because they have a read on you and because they have inside dope that you don't have, right? But now everybody has the potential to have this inside dope, because everybody can go down a rabbit hole and become overnight an expert on some, you know, particular idiom or whatever. And then they can wake you up to it the next day, and then you can go down your own rabbit hole. And so I think we now have the capability of having those same sort of directed experiences, but instead of them being directed by people who are sort of in the business of doing it, it's all an informal network of things. I do appreciate what you're saying about how you can buy something and feel like it's a mistake, but you're still, because you've invested in it, you're still going to see it through and eventually learn something from it. Like there are records that I don't particularly like that I feel like I've learned something from for precisely the same reason. Like, you know, that first Clash album was great. What the fuck is wrong with the second one? Let me listen to it a few hundred times and see if I can figure it out. You know, I totally get that thinking, right? But I don't know of a way to recreate that experience, the sort of desperation of scarcity that you're describing. You know, like, yeah, if that's all we have in the cupboard, that's what we're eating. You know, like I don't know how to recreate that kind of an environment.
We got our last question over here before this reception, which you guys are all invited to.
Awesome. So I had a quick question about, first of all, I've noticed not only during this, but in other lectures that I've seen online, you talk about how some of your favorite records are basically disasters. Yeah. And sort of in line with that too, there have been a few times that you've talked about today, I guess, just about like how accidents can be super informative, and I'm really interested in making music that does that. What are some things that you love about hearing a disaster, and also what are some ways that you can allow a record to incorporate disaster that you can think of?
Well, one is just if you don't have a categorical paradigm, if you don't have a categorical imperative for music, then anything that you're listening to is music, right? So John Cage used to say, you don't have to call it music if the term offends you, you know. So whatever you feel like listening to can be music, and that goes with whatever you're working on in the studio as well. Like, you don't need to be concerned about whether it's appropriate or not. I'm a big believer in that. The film critic Roger Ebert said something in an interview once that I thought was really smart. He said, "I never second guess a belly laugh." Meaning, if he laughs at something, it's funny, full stop. That's all there is to it. And then he said, "I also never second guess an erection." And I feel like if you keep that sort of in the back of your mind, like if you like something, you like it. And there's no reason that you can't pursue that or that you can't cling to that as a thing of value, regardless of what it is, right? When I was in high school, my friend John Rose and I ate a pan of hash brownies and went to a midnight showing of the film The Aristocats. Okay? For years after that, I would mount a spirited defense of The Aristocats as the greatest film ever made. I think that's a perfectly legitimate perspective. Bear in mind, I have not seen it since. Or if I have, I shut it off because it didn't live up to my expectation. So yeah, I think just be open to the idea that you can be the only person in the world that likes something and it's still fine, you know? Like, you can be the only person that's responding to something, and if you respond to it on a personal level, then it's yours forever, right? And it's just as good as if it was academically perfect in some other way. You asked about, or you mentioned, as an aside, that there were some records that I like that are disasters. And I'll give you, the best example is the Stooges' Raw Power record, which is from a sonic standpoint, from a technical standpoint, it is a piece of shit, right? All of the sounds on it are terrible. All of the decisions made in the recording process clearly exacerbated the problems and made them worse, right? There have been several attempts to rectify, and I'm using finger quotes here because I want to maintain an intellectual distance between myself and the definition of this. There have been attempts made to rectify the problems with that. There have been several remixes and remasters done of it. All of them terrible, right? The original recipe, Iggy Pop described that record as like being splashed in the face with a cup of hot coffee. And he's absolutely right. You can tell the people making that record were out of their fucking minds when they made that record. Nobody had a clue. Everything was pursued to the bitter end, even though it was all pointless. And that record is invigorating and thrilling as a result, right? Everything that everybody has done to try to make that record better has made it worse. So that's a really good example of a record that is categorically a disaster, but is also one of the greatest records ever. So I think the thing to do is to not fear eccentricity and to not fear something that is categorically incorrect or categorically, by definition, wrong or missing the target or whatever. If it stimulates you, if it excites you, don't second guess your belly laugh. You laughed at it, it's funny, it's fine, That's me stealing Roger Ebert's genius. So. I needed that, thank you. Okay.
Well, I want to kind of thank you again. I want to close. I really do find your worldview incredibly inspiring. I feel lucky to know you and to share a timeline in reality with you. So. But and we got through an entire discussion on the internet without me having to say "Okay, boomer" to you. Of which solely
I should point out that every time I've heard anybody say, I think I technically qualify as a boomer. I was born in 1962. I don't know. Does that make me legit a boomer? Every time I've heard anybody say to anybody else, "Okay, boomer," every time I've heard that or seen it, it's been absolutely appropriate.
Stephen, yep. Stephen solely thought I'd have to say it at least two. The line was said at 1.5 times, but we actually got through 0 times. So thank you again. Thank you for coming to Drexel. And everyone, please join us in the lobby for refreshments.